welcome to our session. For those of you who don't know who I am the director of the Institute and Conquest Guerra. And today we have if you could mute your computer so we don't have the echo. What are we having today? So, Diana Reddy is going to introduce the speakers today. She's our graduate research assistant, and so, Diana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the Institute for Historical Studies in the Department of History today for the launch of our new program for the 22-2023 academic year. We have a rich and diverse program offerings coming up for this year, and you can find our current calendar events in the IHS website. And yes, please view the schedule and make plans to join us either in person or online all this year. And just a very brief note before we get started, as I already see many of you are helping yourselves with coffee and brownies. Both the cups and all the items today are compostable, and they can be placed in the green compost bin. So if you have any questions, just let us know. And now on to the introductions. We are fortunate today to be joined by Dr. Julie Hartwig. She will be the respondent for today's paper. She is the John E. Green Regents Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin, and also Assistant Regents Distinguished Teaching Professor. And she also is the author of several books, including Sex in an Old Regime City, Young Workers and Intimacy in France, 1660-1789, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. She has also published The Practice of Patriarchy, Gender and Politics of Household Authority in Early Modern France, published by Penn State University Press in 1998, and Family Business, Litigation and the Political Economy of Daily Life in Early Modern France. We're especially honored to host Dr. Hartwig today because she was the founding director of this institute back in 2007 up until 2013. And now as the IHS marks its 15th year in 2022, well, this is a milestone. And our speaker and author of the paper under discussion today is Dr. Benjamin Claude Brouwer. He's an associate professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in the history of colonial era North Africa and modern France. His research centers on the problem of violence in history, secularism and Islam, and language and colonialism. His first book, A Desert Named Peace, The Violence of France's Empire in the Algerian Sahara, 1844-1902, was published by Columbia University Press in 2009 and won the Society for French Historical Studies, David H. Pinky Prize that same year. And also the Middle East Studies Association's Albert Harani Award in 2010. He is currently completing a history of names in colonial era Algeria, which examines the conversion of Algerian personal names to French standards as part of an investigation into symbolic power and the legacies of colonial violence. He is a fellow at the Institute for Historical Studies in the present year.
Okay, great. Well, take it over.
Yes. So for those of us who are here, we'll have the mechanics essentially 10 minutes by Ben, then 10 minutes by Julie, and then back to Ben, kind of a ping pong here, intellectual ping pong, and then he addresses most of whatever the questions are by Julie, and then we'll open up for discussion.
Okay, great. I need to
You mute yours.
So I leave mine muted.
Yes,
okay,
and we rely on that sound.
Mic's coming from up there. Okay,
Yes.
great. All right, good. But I will share my screen, right?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for everyone for coming, and Thanks for your time, first and foremost. I know this is already a very busy time of the semester, the sort of acceleration. We started a little bit earlier this year, and I don't know, we're hitting full bore this semester already, and so I'm sure many are feeling mid-semester exhaustion already. So thank you for coming. Thank you for Julie for taking the time to read the paper and offer your comments. I'm very much looking forward to that. Thank you to everyone at the IHS, its director, Jorge, Courtney, for doing. I think we've just seen a demonstration of how essential she is to the institute, and to my fellows and other people who have come to share this work. I really appreciate your time. So this is what you have here is the 4th chapter in a book that I'm completing that deals with the question of naming and power, or the colonization of names during the colonial period. It deals specifically with the period from the early colonial period, which you have here in this text, and it'll deal up until the First World War. So it's sort of the chronology of this all. So I suppose in a nutshell, this is a project that tries to get at the eternal question, what is in a name? And it asks this in specific environment, the colonial situation. What does a name mean in a colonial situation? So the book divides itself, the chapters divide themselves between a look at personal names in particular, and look at the sort of changes and transformations they went through under the colonial period. And the paper that you have today looks at the sorts of uses that names are put to, okay? Particularly in the reason that Algerian names are changed is so they better fit into French administrative procedures, in particular, a very, very important administrative institution, which is the état civil, or civil status, is the best way to translate that into English. And so this is on the état civil. Now, let me just say a few words about the état civil itself and where it comes from. So the état civil is a French version of vital statistics, or in the early modern period, medieval period, they're known as the parish registers. They had been collected by ecclesiastical authorities. So we're talking about here about baptisms under the church, marriages, and deaths. And in 1792, in the first years of the revolution, the French state exerts a monopoly over the état civil. They had been in an arrangement with the church where there would be double registers. The church authorities would produce 2 versions of vital records, and one of them would go to the state. In 1792, the French state asserts exclusive control over the vital registers. And they're doing this for a couple of different things. Immediately in 1792, they see this as a way to do 2 things, both within emancipatory logic. First, to restructure the family, the sort of way that the family works itself out on paper as an immense normative power. So what is a family? Who belongs in it? How is it composed? Can be produced through these registers. And so it does things like introduces civil marriage, secular marriage ceremony. And also at this particular time, this doesn't last long, it institutes the possibility of divorce through these registers. Right, so the family, it's also looking at ways in which a new sovereign people can be brought into existence, okay? Looking for the citizen, try to instantiate or constitute the citizen. And this is all done around an idea of emancipation. So if you look through these texts around that people are debating law at the time, the sort of move towards a secular état civil takes with it a lot of rhetoric and understandings the church had used. So one of the lawmakers who's talking about the importance of this particular move, he talks about the état civil as the altar of the fatherland, right? And really, I mean, this may be familiar to some of you who know that the French rituals are sort of rituals associated with this even to today. So when a child is born, the child has to be brought before the mayor or another officer of the état civil who verifies the child's that it is live, it verifies the sex of the child. It's a sort of ceremony that has certain analogs with the baptismal rite. So this is what this particular lawmaker is talking about when he talks about it as the altar of the fatherland. So this is 1792. Very quickly, as some of you will know, and sort of sketch this, revolution takes a more conservative turn. And as it goes into the 19th century, the état civil becomes wedded to the new civil code. And it does specific sorts of work in both deciding what is a citizen, but particularly parsing which parts of the civil code. So like any law code, this has prohibitions and this has rights. The civil code particularly is rich in rights. This is one of its claims to fame. And what it does, what the état civil does, is it parses which parts of the rights will be engaged for a particular person. So throughout the 19th century and into much of the 20th century, women, for example, are excluded from many of the rights that are possible. And not just women in terms of their biology, which again is established at birth, but women as they go through different stages of their life, particularly in marriage is a very perilous moment for women when they lose a great deal of their rights. Okay, and so the état civil measures that over the course of a person's life. Now, so in this you have an official name, and this is fixed. This is something that comes out of the revolution as well. French names are transformed into a two-part name, fixed at birth for life. There is the sex, as I mentioned. There are ages, marital status, and affiliation. Who are the parents? And this is all established in paper. So it's a certain, it's one of these moments in which the living human being, either sort of flesh and blood, is transformed into documents. Right? And this is what produces the subject of law. And sort of person stands before the law. It's really not the physical person in the courtroom, but the sort of paperwork and the file, the état civil documents that establishes the subject of the law. All right, and then just one final sort of thing on this question. I first presented this project in 2018 in the Institute, and some of you were here. Remember that I talked a lot about it in terms of the état civil as a technology of identification. At that particular time, I was looking at it as like, look, this is maybe one of these tools that contributes to society or control. Right, we sort of identify, precise, individuate individuals as sort of police technology. And one of the reasons I come to that understanding is because this is a way that people in the late 19th century, early 20th century, specifically colonial context, are talking about the état civil. Right, this is why we need the état civil. This is what we can do with it. Well, COVID sort of upended everyone's lives, and so it allowed me, or sort of forced me, to do a deep dive in French legal texts in the summer of 2020. You can't get any. There's no interlibrary loan. The library's closed. French language 20th century texts are impossible to get that summer. Unlike English language texts, there's no ebooks available for French language sources. And so, but there's this huge wealth of 19th century scanned documents that are available online. And one of the biggest sort of fields that I found during the 19th century are legal reference manuals. It's sort of whole forests were laid waste to produce the paper to print these texts, these legal manuals. And so I did a deep dive on this, and what I realized fairly early on is this is not about a police technology. Right? One of the things the état civil does not do is it does not have a physical description. Right? Unlike the sort of things that people need to track individuals, it's not a technology of identification in that sense. And so anyway, so this is one of the things that the colonial authorities will try to adapt it for. Right? This is why these sources later on are talking about this so much. But this is not the way it originally, this is not the purposes it's supposed to serve at its origin. Okay, so the paper takes many twists and turns, and I won't have time to rehearse them all. But one of the questions that I'm looking at is how the état civil works beyond French borders. In particular, how it is used to claim sovereignty. And this can happen in a couple of different ways. One, like a census, it claims people for a particular sovereign. You belong to me, I count you, you belong to me, you're part of my resources, which it does. And also, by performing, actually recording the act itself, is something of a sovereign prerogative especially after 1792, when the state asserts a monopoly over this. This is a sovereign right. And this is why the people in 1792 talk about it. Like, we are getting this out of the hands of the church. And doing so, we assert our right as a sovereign nation, expressing the will of the sovereign people. So this becomes tricky when you're recording acts for people who are living outside of French territory. The understanding that territory is, the sovereignty is for the most part understood in terms of territory. So what happens when you have a French couple, a man or a woman who in a mixed marriage in Russia, and some of the German states, and other parts of the world, right? Who is going to perform these acts? If they're performed by a foreign authority, are they valid in France? And so forth. And I'll follow up on that in a moment if I have some time. But in any case, the question that it looks at is the question of French sovereignty in Algeria itself. Now, the story that has long been told and still told and sort of implicitly understood by historians is that French sovereignty begins with the sort of events that you see on the screen here. This is an image, the épinal, sort of cheap woodcut images that proliferated in the 19th century and probably before. It represents the what's known as the fall of Algiers, or la prise d'Alger in French. And this was understood and presented as the moment in which French sovereignty came to Algeria through a military conquest. Now, that's all fair enough and good, but this is not the way the sovereignty is passing at the end of the 18th century and early 19th century. Things have changed a lot during the revolution. One of our former fellows at the IHS, Ed Kola, did a book on this. He's looking about how it's working in Europe. He doesn't look at outside of Europe, he looks at Europe, and some very important things that are happening at this time. First, in 1790, French revolutionaries forbid wars of conquest, right? Wars that are fought for territorial acquisition. Right? In this sense, sovereignty has to pass hands. These are development, these are in flux. Sovereignty passes hands through things like conventions, congresses, and treaties. There is no treaty by which the Ottoman Empire passes its control of Algiers, one of its provinces, to France. There's no Congress of European powers that decide this. There's not even really a sense within French lawmakers themselves when and what French sovereignty will be. So sovereignty in a formal sense doesn't write itself in paper in Algiers, right? In the sort of big, high from above moments. And so I'm looking at the état civil as how sovereignty writes itself from below, right? Through keeping the vital registers, right? This prerogative of sovereignty itself, and who is identified and in which modality they're identified, which registers they're written into. Okay? So long story short, Europeans have fairly easy access to the French registers in this period in the 1830s when everything is up in flux. The Jews of Algiers, the city I looked at, the capital, have some access to these registers as well. Access which gives them certain possibilities, certain advantages, but also carries certain risks, as I highlight in terms of a civil marriage. This time, French civil code does not recognize divorce. So what does it mean to Jews, Algerian Jews, who marry before French authorities by French law? They lose this right. This is something that's not clear at the time. It's also very, very difficult because you need all of these French documents no one has. And then the case of Muslims who are completely absent in the registers for the capital city of Algiers. There's not a single Muslim that I can find in those registers. And so I looked outside of the capital into an important port city, Annaba or Bonn, where they're appearing in haphazard ways, but most systematically in the death records. Right? So if the état civil is trying to claim local people as French as a way to sort of extend its roots of sovereignty, they're only interested in Muslim Algerians at the moment of their death, when they're really of no use whatsoever in terms of making a sovereign claim. And so I draw some conclusions from that. All right, so I'll stop there. And again, thank you all, and I'm looking to hearing back from you.
Thank you.
All right, so let me just share my screen here. Okay. All right, good. Well, thank you, Ben, for inviting me to do this. I should say this is an allergy cough. I just want to clarify that in all the times that I'm having here. Thank you for inviting me, Ben, to do this. I'm delighted to be participating in the first IHS event of the year, and Diana and Jorge. I also was thinking about the 15th anniversary of the IHS. So when Courtney and I started this long ago, I think neither of us could have imagined 15 years of this. And I do want to say it's Courtney's magic that actually has been keeping it rolling along for these 15 years. And so grateful to you, Courtney, for hanging in there for all this time to make this happen. I am very, very interested in parish registers, and I must say this paper gave me the opportunity to mosey around a bit this weekend in some French registers, and it was very interesting for me and also useful in ways that I didn't expect, actually, with a project that I'm just starting to work on. So that was great. This is so lucky to call this my work category, definitely. I do want to say that on Ben's specific question about the parish registers, we have a fabulous new colleague, Professor Melanie Lamont, here with us today. And she works on the 17th century Francophone Empire, and she's done a lot with colonial parish registers. So I think that's very interesting for the longue durée aspects of this. And I welcome you, Melanie, to our community historians UT. The usual caveats. I have the disadvantage of not having read before or after in the chapters here, and I'm definitely well out of my zone in 19th century Algeria. So my comments, as you can see from the slide here, are from the hexagon and from much earlier. I'm not going to rehearse Ben's terrific paper because you've all read it and he's reminded you of parts of it, except to say I love the way he centers what he so nicely calls a banal administrative act. Measure, actually, banal administrative measure, the registration of vital acts at the center of, or as a central arm of French colonialism. Not so banal in terms of its dynamics and consequences, as you show them. And this is one of the things I must say I also love about the parish registers, that in the small stories of parish registers, of individual parish register entries, multiple histories are embedded. Demographic histories, religious histories, family histories, micro-histories, reproductive histories, histories of political and commercial networks, states or imperial history, histories of bureaucracy, histories of displacement, coercion, and diaspora. Early modern historians are interested in them as a type of life writing, and I'm going to say something more about that. They seem almost infinitely useful and infinitely fungible, if that's the right word, in all kinds of ways for our projects. And so I'm thrilled to have them centered today. I want to raise 3 points that struck me while I was reading it. And these 3 are all linked, I think, to 2 very important issues and thorny questions, I think, for us all as historians and for Ben working out the finishing stages of this manuscript. One is the distance between the goals of the state and what's happening on the ground. And especially, not only, but especially in colonized regions, perhaps, and the judgments and actions being made by very low-level officials on the ground. And they seem the key actors, or they were the key actors, in making a practice out of the prescription of this legislation, both in terms of managing the events and in terms of recording them. And you describe the management of the current system in France very nicely there, where you present the baby and all of these kinds of things. That is for using, one of Ben's many wonderful phrases, using vital acts to compromise sovereignty by what he calls performing and recording vital acts that represented sovereignty. And the second issue, I think, well, this is especially interesting for Melanie and I and Jorge and others, I think, perhaps who work a bit earlier, or Martha, what's different or modern, let's say, about what was going on with the French case in Algeria, and where it fits into longer and wider historical patterns. So I'm going to have a bit of show and tell here, as you can see on the side. And the first thing I want to think about is the long histories of the état civil and the wide, longer histories of the intersection of vital acts with hierarchies of power, coercion, and symbolic violence. In France, as in a lot of other European countries, registers of vital acts were part of early modern state projects. That is the project of information gathering from the 16th century. In France, 2 royal decrees in 1539 and 1579 required that births, deaths, and marriages be kept in separate registers and be recorded. I know what Ben means, that these were different than the état civil records after 1792, because they were kept by the clergy and the records were kept in churches. But they were always a state project and initiated by the state for the purposes of the state. That is the requirement to keep these registers. They were part of the early modern imperial project too. So I think Melanie knows far more about than I do. And the longer and wider patterns about naming were a context for that. People held in slavery across the early modern world who were baptized or renamed. So that colonization by names, I love actually how you put that, Ben. They were denied the legal sanction of marriage, so their intimate partnerships were excluded from registers, even though their baptisms might be recorded and so on. And these projects always involved on the ground decision-making, routinization of practices, and so on. That's my big first issue today. I was looking at the dynamics about this in some French registers from Nantes and the Breton coastal towns above Nantes this weekend, where many people who've been enslaved of African descent and a few of South Asian descent actually arrived and made their lives in France for longer or shorter times. Mostly they were held in slavery because despite the well-known adage that there are no slaves in France, which was articulated and reiterated endlessly from the 16th century, a much less well-known early 18th century ruling allowed enslavers to bring people who were enslaved into France and to keep them enslaved in France on the grounds that they trained them for a job and that they brought them up as good Catholics. So in fact, many people were held in slavery in France, despite there being no slaves in France, by the way that people, enslavers, were able to use this registration loophole, as we would say today. Even in metropolitan France, I think we can see striking examples of what I would call what I thought on Saturday I would call the micropolitics of possession, where the state and the church allied with white French subjects to emphasize all the ways in which a person who had been held in slavery could continue to be held in slavery. And these micropolitics of possession involved decisions of on-the-ground actors and the daily practice of the assertion of what I'm just going to call today, and that's what I put on the slides for a quick 18th century version, white Christian nationalism. And I think this really resonates with what Ben terms as the symbolic violence that's involved in the way that these acts are being registered. So I could talk all day and all night about this, and I told Jorge only 10 minutes. So I'm just giving you a couple of examples here, and if you can look more closely on the PowerPoint. One is here, a Black woman from Senegal, Marie Françoise. Obviously that wasn't her West African name. So she was recorded with her new name. She was 19, she belonged to, that is, she was enslaved by a nobleman who brought her for baptism in one of the small towns along the Breton coast in 1731. And 2 years later, she was returned there as the mother of a daughter, also with a French name, Elizabeth there. So, so many small stories in these, in these small stories, so many, this is what I mean by kind of sites. Oh, I'm going to get to that. Okay, let me stop that. And here on the other side, my share screen is in the way. Okay. A 9-year-old, also from West Africa, from Senegal, belonging to, again, that is enslaved by one of a guy who worked for the company of the West Indies, brought to the baptismal font of St. Louis by somebody different, and in both of these cases, assisted by a woman. And I think that's very striking. And we always see that in that classification in the records. Under the Marie Françoise, you can see that it's somebody from Malabar. Actually, that is somebody from the other side of the Indian Ocean, so going on. So, you know, when we think about what's going on here, oh, and I want to say that I have some more information from these people, often the actual act of registration, which you can see at the top here. There's somebody from the Congo at the top, a young woman from 13-year-old from the Congo, names her parents with their African name, actually, the name of her parents, the village and the kingdom that it was from. Presented by, again, at the font, brought to the baptism font by not the person who owned her, and again assisted by a woman. Then someone else, another person from Malabar, somebody from whose origin isn't given here at the bottom, somebody from Angola. And some of these, the extra information there comes from these documents of registration when the enslaver initially registered them, and then, you know, going to baptism to fulfill the terms of the registration was a separate act. So what we see here, among many other things, are capsule histories of France as a site of the African diaspora, and also some South Asian people who were enslaved. There's been much more work on that in England, in fact, than there has in France about South Asians. Where's the law here? Ben is so attentive to the law in reading these registers, and that was very helpful for me then to think about that. There's at least two legal frames here. One is the legal requirement to keep a register of vital acts, and the second is the legal requirement that to hold enslaved people, as I was just telling you, as enslaved in France, enslavers had to register them. So those two acts intersect here in when we see these baptism records. The names are colonized, as Ben put it there. But in this intertwining of baptism and the record of it with renaming, we also see actors on the ground creating a new status as an enslaved person in France, owned by somebody with a new name, as the symbolic, legal, and religious expression of all of that. White women as well as men were active parties in this process. As I said, there's always a woman, and not obviously the wife of the enslaver, or obviously not in some cases. The prominence of young people in this is very striking to me, as the bearers of this new status in France, enslaved, assimilated by name and soon by occupation. The work of the state regulation of hierarchy, of this racialized hierarchy, being done on the ground by record keepers and a variety of white allies, making that happen. And some other things I could say about that. My second point here is about thinking about these parish registers as life writing. Early modern Europeanists have become very interested in that, and I'm wondering if that might be useful for Ben. So I'm going to share two of my favorite examples. This is one from Lyon, of course. All my examples that are from Brittany, from Lyon, as those of you who know my history of working in France know. And this is a clerk in the 19th century who was working on creating a 19th century copy of the état civil, as Ben was saying, that they were copying the pre-1792 registers that had been held in churches and made by clergy into état civil registers. And he just doodled away his time here. Here, I've enlarged this one for you, where he's made a doodle of a breastfeeding mother there, which is like, okay, he's writing all these entries down about babies being born and baptisms, and his mind's wandering to that. Here you can see in the other one how it actually looks on the page, that is, the scale was very small of the doodles. So that's one example of what we mean by life writing here. Another is one of my all-time favorites, which is this one from 1776. It was a priest recording the baptism of a newborn, and actually continued on the other side of this page, so far beyond what a priest might normally write. And he writes about the newborn had been found by a cross on a very cold night at 3 a.m. by a widow who just happened to be there. And the widow took her in but couldn't find the parents, and so brought her over next morning, you know, to the priest to be baptized. My favorite detail here actually is on the next page, which is that her swaddling was tied with tobacco string. Who knows what was going on here? a lot of speculation, but this is literally a priest's life writing about like his workplace, if you like, here as part of the registration of of her baptism. These two examples are obviously at the far end, the most explicit way in which we see life parish registers as a type of life writing, but I think they also remind us that people on the ground were making these decisions about what to write and how they were writing it. And I love the one who modified the protocol in your paper, because that's a way in which that was, clearly a kind of life writing for him, illustrating your records. And finally, I'm thinking of the registers as life writing and of the sort of acts, what was actually going on in situ when these events were made, might help get at this thorny question of the role of officials on the ground. Until the very end here, I think there's a tiny tendency to reify and passive voice of it. How this is all worked out on the ground. At one point you say the French registers closed themselves, which I know is a rhetorical point on your part, but also sort of illuminates that. So you write on page 17, the état civil became a tool for France to begin work at attaching Algeria to itself while obscuring its actual operation intent. So a kind of stealth on the ground campaign. And my question would be or my suggestion would be to encourage you to bring out a bit more who actually is conducting, who are making the decisions, who are involved, who are the allies, and in the recorders themselves, what was making this happen on the ground. We get an occasional glimpse here of someone reading a French law out loud, a local translator, that official changing the protocol. But at page 45, you circle back to an absolutely critical point. There were huge gaps, we know this, between state prescription and what was going on the ground in terms of actual practice. And that's a reality that's central to all of our records. So anyway, I'm just encouraging you to see if you can unpack that a bit more. I know it's really hard. Anyway, it was wonderful. Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure for me.
Thank you, Julie. So the big question is there anything new about Algerians?
In terms of
the recording of the data and the use of the data in order to subjugate other population?
For what's new and thanks, Julie, for that very nice reading and for also sharing some of your own notes and so forth. The figures, the drawing, this person put himself at kind of big risk because they're drawn into, he's writing out these things by hand, very laborious, and they're sewn together. You can't sort of pull a page out.
And he regretted it.
And it's just at the end, and the superior sees this, is like, this isn't forbidden. I can't think of any of the rule books that say you can't draw it there, but it certainly goes contrary to the modern état. The sort of the stories that the priest talks about, those are expressly forbidden. Yes. They don't want that sort of stuff getting into the état civil.
Yes.
They want a more streamlined process, and they also want to, they see it in terms of protection, right? A protection of the civil status. So for example, if your father is imprisoned or condemned, the sort of taint that would happen through the family, they want, there's affiliation. This is very, very important. The sort of taint affiliation is not supposed to be multi-generation, right? So that the child is born into a family, but he shouldn't inherit the parent's sins in this case. So a foundling would be one of these people. One of the ways in which this happens in the 19th century is foundlings are often, they come into the world without a patronym. And so the people who record them often have the ability to give patronage. And what they do frequently, perhaps not often, is that they give pejorative names to them, or names that identify them as a foundling, right? Which carries this taint through the rest of their life. And this is one of the, what Algerians in the 20th century are most concerned about. So getting back to names, right? You sort of see how they're linked to the institutions, is pejorative names. And the idea is that when they were first, their families were first registered by a French official, that this official took advantage, as we're talking about here, for the most part, peasant people, people who have very limited skills in French, and certainly have very limited, if any, skills in writing in any language. So they take advantage of their ignorance to write them in under a pejorative name. And so people in the, after independence, when this becomes a larger question of decolonization, how do we, the French are gone after 1962, how do we decolonize ourselves, right? How do we reclaim, how do we overdo colonial alienation? What about our names? The sign which is most fundamental and essential and intimate to us and constitutes us. And we're named after wild animals, we're named after these that we today don't recognize as proper names. And so, this becomes an active debate. In any case, this is one way in which, according to your question, what's new and different in Algiers and modern France, this would be one where they're the same, right? Different sort of amplification. The more precise answer or immediate one that comes out in the sources, the French état civil after 1792 are not supposed to mention race. This isn't a category or religion. And the person who's writing up the registers in Annaba and also the registers in Algiers is including that as a category. Right? And I think that's one of the things that's important. And I think I mentioned this in the paper. It's one of the things that pops out of the registers. These early 19th century registers are super difficult to read. Right? So I'm sort of looking at this as the demographers, because demographers use these to figure out how many people are in a given place in absence of other sources. And it's very difficult to hunt, pick. We were talking about how slow they are to download the digital images, but even if you have the full registers, you have to hunt and pick because everything is written out longhand, even the dates. And the person who's doing this puts the race right in the heading, right up by the person's name itself. So that's easy. You can flip through that to know exactly how many deaths of maîtresse or Moors or the different sort of categories that they're using at this time. They're actually quite limited. There's a larger lexicon that they can use, different sort of categories that can use, but these registers are really talking about race like 20th century sort of physical appearance sort of understandings, right? Even though this is race articulates itself in very, very complex ways in North Africa being the 19th century. So so I don't know, did that sort of get to the question of the differences? And I think there's a legal question. I very much appreciate the sort of what's going on the ground. That's why I asked you as social historian, because there's the law and there's what people are doing in terms of practice. And this is a paper that nods towards that. But it is a top-down, in many ways, sort of project, looking at. So I have to deal with ideal types, and I have to deal with sort of larger conceptualizations, which I very much have no expectations that these are followed to the letter on the ground, unless I think it's still telling us something useful. And this is the first. This is the first. This is the first project to do this. So there's a certain way in which a clearing of the terrain and sort of writing out this particular part of the problem. And then I certainly anticipate that people will be coming after with the full registers and looking at and starting to do this really, really detailed fine work. Incredible sources, really, really amazing sources.
Well, there's a big difference, it seems to me, between the cases that Julie describes and yours, which is the issue of a stealth sovereignty, that her examples are about France and the slaves that are coming from Senegal.
The sovereignty is very explicit, not
there's
contested.
No need to, it's there.
Yeah.
But in your case, is this transition between an Algiers that is not yet colonized and one that is eventually going to be colonized. So the French have not yet established clear sovereignty. The fact that the Muslim population is not in the records says that there is another authority out there for this population who are the majority in both cities. Right? So my question is, in this period in which the French are not really imposing names on Algerians of Islamic descent, that they have no control over these populations in terms of statistics or in terms of vital records. They don't go through the act of this ritual process of naming and marriage, etc., etc. They are outside the sovereignty of the French state. So what is the function of these records beyond the Algerians of Jewish descent and Italians or other Europeans.
So the question that you're asking is, and why would people do this? What's the purpose of?
No, I understand for the Europeans, perhaps not. Well, I think the explanation you give for the Jews of Jewish Algerians who are doing it, who are going through the act of ritual subordination to the sovereignty of the French colonial state is clear, but what is the relationship of this state that has not clear sovereignty over the Muslim population? What is the relationship of that state with the Muslim population if they cannot do any of these?
Yeah. Let me sort of place this let me frame it the following way. One of our former PhD students, who's Monica Jimenez, who is our colleague now at UT in African diaspora, part of her dissertation was looking at Puerto Rico. And one of the things the United States did with Puerto Rico, and this is early 20th century, that sort of opened my eyes to these early possibilities of doing this. The United States wants Puerto Rican territory, does not want Puerto Rican people. Right? So this is sort of common to imperial projects, the European imperial projects throughout the 19th and 20th century. And I think maybe it's different than earlier ones. I think in particular, the notion of sovereignty, the people's a sovereign all of a sudden in the 19th century. Before they're subjects, they can sort of do whatever. And in the 19th century, this becomes a real problem. So what do you sort of do with things? Do they have rights? Do they have one of the only meaningful rights that Algerians get is the right to private property. Right? This is where the main projects goes. And why do they want to have the rights to private property? So they can sell their land. Right? Private ownership disentangles it out of the family. Property embedded in these large webs of social relationships is very, very difficult to get that out. And the French do everything. The individual affects the names is to break up the family into individuals, individual property owners, on a patriarchal French model. Right? And then the patriarch, all powerful within the family, takes the property to the marketplace and he sells it of his own volition. And his cousins, his uncles, his sister will have some rights to that through inheritance. She falls out of the wayside. And so, this is in the 1830s. This is 50 years later. In the 1830s, we want this land, and these people are kind of here. We could establish, we have all sorts of rivals for our claims here. The British in particular are the most immediate and dangerous rivals for this, but the Ottomans are not insignificant, and they most have the most legal claims, the most legitimate claims to Algeria. Right? So this sense, in the legal sense, are very, very important. What do we do with the people? Eventually, what they do in a legal sense is they partition them out of French law. To a point in the 1860s, they'll have French nationality, but they don't get French citizenship. Right? So we recognize you as French nationals. You belong to us. You respond to our power of command in terms of sovereignty, but the regime of rights remains close to you. And the argument that they make is this remains close to you because your family, your religions are so impregnated by Islam, this is incompatible with the French Civil Code. Right? So we're going to tolerate you outside of this. And this is the way that it's typically understood. There's also a new group of, one person in particular, legal historians are looking at this particular model and say, well, this is inspiring itself from Ottoman legal codes and the millet system, the ways in which legal communities were divided up in the Ottoman Empire based upon confession. Right? So it's not just sort of an innovation that the French bring into this, but they're also building upon existing institutions. Right? Anyways, this is sort of the backdrop of what is going on there. Now, I think, so when I see the absence of Muslims in the registers in Algiers, from a nationalist perspective, it's like, yeah, of course they're not going to register because they're refusing the French. We want nothing to do with the French. We're not going to bring our children before you to record their birth. You're certainly not going to get a hand, in our marriage. This is an intimate act in the family. They don't want French civil code in their marriage, for sure. And we don't want you counting our debt, right? Which is in Annabelle, the only thing that they do is they count their debt. And I think this is largely because the municipal officers and the officials, local officials, are going out there in the streets and sort of counting the debt. And this woman that I highlight, Roca, who died, having just arrived in Araba, certainly as an enslaved woman. Her name actually indicates this. So sort of the interpreter finds her down the car, finds her out of her body. Okay, let's get her recorded in. What can you tell me about her? And we get her on the register. So she exists in her death, and this is important to us. But in her life, no. And for the rest of the Muslims in their life, no, because what we're really here for is territory, right? And the people will sort of deal with that later.
Oh, sorry. There are two.
Two races, okay. So I would suggest whoever asks a question introduce himself or herself to the rest of the audience, who you are, et cetera. And then, so we'll begin with you. Please go ahead.
Am I?
Oh, it's a great honor to be a part of your conversation. Can you hear me?
Great.
That was tough. We couldn't hear you.
Daniela, go ahead.
Okay. So thank you so much, Ben, for sharing this chapter. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. One of the things I found perhaps is the most important contribution of the chapter was kind of the meandering nature of the application of the état civil. And also, of course, its connection with the extension of French imperialism in Algeria. So typically when I think about the expansion of French imperialism, I think about it in a different way. So this was truly a joy to read. And, I made a ton of comments on the PDF, and I can send that to you afterwards. So Jorge already hit on some of the things that I was tinkering with regarding Jewish and Muslim Algerians and Algiers. And it's interesting because you make this kind of comment in the paper where you say, this could be one of two things. It could be, everyone in the Muslim community holding the line as an act of resistance. And it also could be, the French essentially saying, and this could be, I was thinking about it in two different ways. It could be, uniformly, administratively, and if not in kind of like written down this decision not to allow Muslims to register. And it's funny because I think I fell on a different side than you, because I was thinking, obviously it's this decision not to allow Muslims in Algiers to register. So hearing you say that you thought the other, I'm like, wow, I'm probably totally wrong then. But I also think it gets to this ambiguity of this application and extension of French imperialism in kind of a larger way. So because I'm dabbling more into the history of medicine, one of the things that I was particularly kind of curious about, especially since we know that Muslims were less likely to register with birth and death, et cetera. Does location of death matter here? What is the kind of expansion of hospitals and medical infrastructure in Algiers and Bonn and larger kind of Algeria in general kind of look like? And does this have an impact beyond, as you mentioned, like midwives reporting births? So how does this layer of the expansion, like I said, of medical infrastructure in Algeria influence reporting practices? And then also by extension, how does kind of access to medicalized spaces, how might it help us understand class as well? And then finally, another thing that I thought was kind of interesting had to do with the marriage proceedings and the ways that essentially replacing religious aspects of ceremony of marriage ceremonies, or I suppose that's probably not the right term. I'm thinking in Portuguese and Creole right now. Oh, hi from Cabo Verde. But how might the addition of kind of French law into ceremonies themselves, how it might help us understand this post-revolutionary moment? And essentially, like if we think of marriages, the ceremonies as performances, placing them in this larger kind of performance of legal power, and maybe like lifting up to a holy state, French law. I don't know, I could be totally wrong there, but it was something that I was, again, tossing around in my mind beforehand. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle. And Danielle is another one of our PhDs, a professor at Colorado College now, and she is Skyping in from Cape Verde. She's doing research right now. Another one of the students I've learned immensely from, posing questions and thinking through things from our own research. So look, the medical spaces, I'm going to have to, I'm not going to have great answers to either one of these because the research just isn't there. There are a lot of medical personnel who are part of this. So like military doctors who show up in the attested view frequently. And people, some of the people who are also choosing outsiders, I think the case I give is of a person from one of the Italian states who works in a medical hospital, military hospital, and is there registering a birth, I believe. In any case, so that's an important part of this. When the laws, so the sort of état civil for Muslims lags at this time, at a particular moment. It could have been open to them, nothing happens. But the, let's call it the biopolitical data, the demographic information that people want to get out of this is covered in different sorts of administrative measures. And so midwives are required to report births. And there are essentially a sort of funeral permit, right, in order to go to a cemetery. So these are sort of bottlenecks in which the French state can intervene and impose this sort of regulations. Right, and the cemetery ones, midwives aren't reporting very consistently, although they're required to in the cities. The death records are much more complete. And again, this can be explained in sort of practical terms on the ground. It's more easy for the cemeteries can be closed off. You can put a police officer in front of them, verify the papers and so forth. The French metropolitan press became very adept at this particular time. This is a subject of great concern to them. Or this is what they're most interested in, right? The sort of, where biopolitics becomes necropolitics, if you will, from Mbembe's arguments. Yeah. And then in terms of the ceremonies, each one of these ceremonies is a certain way in terms of performances of making a claim on. So if you take the Jewish couple that I dealt with at length, right? So they go before the municipal authorities to celebrate their marriage. This is a solemn moment, civil marriage. It's influenced by many of the rites and rituals of religious marriages. It is a civil ceremony. I would, with having no knowledge of this, no one's worked on this, I'm certain that couple also celebrated a religious marriage. Okay. It's sort of upscaling. This is what happens today in France in many cases where religious people who are observant will have two separate ceremonies because religious marriage doesn't matter, right? It has no legal weight. It has to be a civil marriage. And I would think that the Jewish community also wants to get its claim on this couple. I mean, it's sort of a foregone conclusion that they belong to them. Nevertheless, sort of performing the rites of belonging would be important. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. I very much enjoyed reading the chapter, and I have a lot of questions, but I'm only going to ask questions for now.
Your name,
sorry.
your affiliations, everybody.
Okay. Yeah. So my name is Mélanie Lamotte, and I am an assistant professor in French and Italian, and I'm working on French and Italian of the 17th and 18th centuries. And so one part that I found very interesting was when you were talking about the état civil being extended, being used to extend power by claiming certain people as French. But another thing that you also say in your chapter is that often it was people themselves, like the Jews or Europeans who were not French, who took the initiative to have their names recorded in the état civil. And so one of my questions was, what does this tell us about the way the French claim was being extended? Was it extended from the top, or was it extended from the bottom by people taking the initiative themselves? And then my second question would actually, it's kind of I think you kind of already asked it, is about the continuity between what was going on in the French colonies in the early modern period and then what happened in Algeria later. And I was particularly interested in the relationship between the état civil and the claim to sovereignty. So one thing that I don't think that anyone has worked on that for the early modern period, but I felt like the missionaries were actually agents of the crown. And so what does this tell us in terms of like the continuity of like claiming sovereignty in this period? And I haven't read the rest of the book, but I feel like there are like lots of other continuities. For example, when you talked earlier about the use of quite pejorative names in the records of being applied to Algerians, I can certainly think about some examples in the Caribbean, for example, in the early modern period.
Yeah, great. Look, the two questions. Who makes the decision on the ground? Excuse me, on who gets into the registers? In many ways, the decision has already been made when the état civil was conceptualized in a metropolitan environment, which means that what we call French citizens, this is also something that we should put quotation marks around, because there is a lot of up in the air what a citizen means at this particular time. But let's use this as an ideal type of voice. French citizens, French nationals have access to this, and also foreigners. We understand these are foreigners residing in France have access to this. And so when the registers take themselves out of this sovereign enclave of French territory, and export themselves to Algeria. But remember, one of the things maybe that didn't come through clearly enough in this, in terms of the official or formal rights of sovereignty, before France even establishes its own legal powers, this happens in 1834, within 6 months, the registers are out of the hands of the consul, right, which is what happened before. This is what happened. This is the way the registers are kept on French territory, and they're in the hands of a royal commissioner. Right? So already within 6 months, the procedures and the authorities in which the person who's doing the registers have shifted here. And in any case, so the registers are not rewritten, rules aren't rewritten for this context. They're adapted and applied here. And so the rules is anyone can register on these. And even before 1830, Europeans had been using the French registers for various purposes. And so, yes, of course they can come. And then so the question is, well, there are foreigners and there are foreigners. And, very quickly, native-born Algerians are foreigners. This is for a typical colonial situation, foreigners in their own land by French law. And then, then it sort of gets onto the ground level, right, of who's actually recording these things in the modification. What they're really, none about this is clear. What they're really recording this stuff is they want demographic material divided by race, right? So they can figure who's dying. It's really, really important question. Can Europeans survive in Africa? In this case, I just don't have the records that speak to that, right? The sort of typically you have some sort of inter-administrative discussions going on paper that would speak to that. In this case, I don't. Now, one caveat that I should say, the digital records that we have, right, were taken from microfilm. The original registers, the test registers are in Algeria. So sort of colonial archive question. The original registers remained in Algeria after 1962. The French in the 1970s sent teams to go and photograph these on microfilm. And then what we have is a digitized version of the microfilm. Now, the team that did this went there under the understanding that they would only be taking French records back, right? European records. So they weren't supposed to photograph Muslim records. So it may be that the registers in Algiers for Muslims were kept separately, in a separate volume. And so as people come in there, it's like, okay, we're not supposed to stuff. Right? The Jews are here. Now, that's one possibility, right? It's an archival question. However, I think it's the argument I'm making. This is they're kept off the rolls. This is the one that I feel most strongly about, because they're not intermixed in the other registers. At a point, Jews get their own registers, Europeans get their own registers in Algiers. but there's a moment where they're mixed in together, right? And in this moment, this early moment, there aren't any Muslims. In any case, this shows up the importance, and there are certain things that I can't answer, questions I can't answer with the source that I have that are very, very interesting. Those were phrased on the previous software. Now, the continuities between, let's call it an old regime understanding how the parish registers are used outside of this. Here I defer to you, and I want to learn from you, because in this particular, there's just not a lot of, there's some stuff on how the registers are used in French slave colonies to sort of divide out, particularly to take race in the parson between free and enslaved, right? And registers are really, really important to me. Deciding what is a really fundamental question of the slave society. Other than that, in terms of how they work in initial moment of articulation, French power in this place is, I just did not know.
I think their work will encourage some scholars to
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, I think this is something that's got some extra.
Elizabeth Bishop.
Thank you very much for recognizing me. Professor Brower, thank you for this very important work. Please accept my apology. I did not hear the last question. It's possible that my question steps on territory that you've already covered. But I think that I find this work important for the first reason, in that we all have to deal with the epistemological, and that includes the supposedly universalizing category of citizenship, which in the 20th century we understand to be distinguished between the citizenship of the land and the citizenship of the blood, referring to how it is transmitted. Yet your work introduces this idea that Professor Hardwick calls life writing as a third term that our attention is neglected. I find the examples that you show so very helpful for understanding both the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 20th century, of course, you're addressing the Spanish immigrant community in Algeria, helps us to understand the puzzle of the French philosopher Albert Camus' mother, who was of Spanish origin. Her family had entered Algeria in the 19th century, the period you address. I so much enjoyed the images that accompanied your talk. For example, that first one of an identity card, for me, answers the question of what was the French poet Albert Rimbaud's father doing in Algeria. And as you suggest, without using the words, Frederick Rimbaud was writing identity cards for Algerian citizens, Algerians. I have two questions, however, for you. My first question addresses the communities that you chose to analyze. Of course, we all have to make these choices. You chose the Jews of Algiers and the specific demographic of Aneba, a community which changed and grew during the 19th century, becoming a French majority population. I'm wondering if any of your views of this process of life writing would be distinguished if you were also to pay attention to the second largest city in Algeria, the third on the coastline, the city of Oran or Oran, which has a distinct nature. As you know, it's predominantly Spanish. It is the home to the only bull ring on the African continent. The mountain overlooking it is still referred to by its name, Santa Cruz. But this city, which had pledged its loyalty to the Spanish crown until 1798, remained a very important trading port for the agrarian empire in Muascar, or Mascara. My second question addresses this praxis of life writing as a manufacturing of sovereignty in the context of greater narratives of sovereignty as conferred by treaty. As you and I both well know, there were many treaties signed between the Crown of France, its diplomatic representatives, and its military commanders, and Algerians. The Emir Abdelkader signed too the Treaty of Tefna in 1837 as but one of them. And I'm wondering if you would be comfortable positing this praxis of life writing against the grand narratives of sovereignty as conferred by treaty. Thank you again for this very valuable work. Thank you again for sharing it with us. I appreciate your generosity.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for coming in. And Elizabeth Bishop is a fellow here and one of kind of a handful of Algerian specialists in the state of Texas. So it's really a treat to have her thoughts here on this. Look, the question of cities and Annaba versus Paran or Bonn versus Oran is certainly an important one. The records, Wahan is, as you mentioned, is something of a special case, with its long, you sort of tally up the time that it was a Spanish possession, the time that France is in Algeria, and I think Spain is in Algeria longer than France is, up until the late 18th century. So it has a particular history. Annaba is different, and Annaba, both of these are sort of borderland cities, so sovereignty is up for grabs in each of them. You talked about the Emir Abdelkader, he's from Western Algeria, like Oran. Morocco has its eyes on Western Algeria, just like Eastern Algeria, where Annaba is, or Bonn is also a contested place. Look, I think, extending the exercise would certainly show up some of the differences, right, in a more systematic way. And at this point, I just, I don't have those records. And so sort of moment of the records in Annaba were complete. There's also some very good recent work done on the early history of Annaba, which is helpful in terms of contextualizing this thing. So I just have a more solid footing to work on the Eastern port city. But certainly the questions could open it up more widely. Now, rethinking treaties as life writing. I think we can also think about quick quotations around citizenship. I think sovereignty is also something we need to put quotation marks around, because there's so many different modalities of sovereignty. And in this particular, in Algeria in 1830, you have sort of three overlapping notions of sovereignty. You have this developing modern European understanding, then an old regime understanding that still is not in the dustbin of history. And you have an Ottoman understanding of how sovereignty works. Now, all of them, in one way or another, articulate themselves between people and territory. And for most of them, their articulations, territory is paramount. And there's lots of really great recent work on the Ottoman Empire, diplomatic history, legal history. And another resource we have on campus, Sami Ayoub, did an early article in his career looking at how the early Hanafi legal school, which is dominant in the Ottoman Empire, conceptualized the sovereignty in territorial ways, right? He was re-examining this question from a sort of globalized Islam perspective. He said, no, the Hanafi jurists look at this, and sovereignty is territorial based. Law is based in terms of territory. Dar al-Islam is not a global phenomenon, but has certain territorial limits. And I think that article is very, very useful to me in thinking about this. But certainly, treaties can be made. They can be deceptive. The treaties you were talking about in the 1830s with the Emir Abdelkader are, as we know, deliberately deceptive, as they're working between two different languages. There's an Arabic version of the treaty. There's a French language version of the treaty. And they say different things about, again, territorial sovereignty, where are the borders of Algeria, and who is sovereign within these different borders. So certainly, yeah, the sort of fine reading of this and the sort of life histories reading of this would open up. We sort of take these things as sort of finished questions, signed and sealed. It's a treaty after all, right? And this is what it means. And I think those need to be re-examined. One of the things in terms of the conquest of Algiers is retrospectively, the French graphed on because they're looking for justification, legal justification by which they can claim sovereignty here. And they graphed on, they take what had been a surrender agreement, which goes down the historiography as the convention. This is signed between the Dey and the French General Bourmont, the 5th of July, 1830, outside of the walls of Algiers. And if you look at the document, it's really just about surrender of a city, nothing about transfer of authority or long-term effects, the consequences of this military defeat. And then retrospectively, during the course of the 19th century, especially the early 20th century, when the historians start working on this, like, okay, this is the document by which France claims sovereignty in Algeria, right? Which of course in the context this is not at all what's happening. So this has been sort of ways to sort of extend what you're talking about. Thank you.
Mark?
Let me get my notes. Ben, thank you for a fantastic paper. These are very instrumental comments. I didn't expect to be called upon. Those are my notes, so I'll do it from memory. And instrumental in the sense that we will be team teaching globalization together next semester, something ahead of. So if I'm talking about Japan, it's in a deeply engaged pedagogy. It's not self-absorption, think like how to abandon my topics. And so one that comes up here is, it's sort of what you about the paper, but I wonder if you could foreground it first when we teach together, but also in here, the tension between sort of the two voices of empire and France being arguably, according to what I've learned in research, the first to insist that our imperialism is not imperialism, it's emancipatory. So there's always this tension between we're liberating you, right? This is not the conquest, but at the end of the day, sort of the metropole just wants stuff. So there's that tension going through it. And then particularly since this is a claim to a place that was previously Ottoman, I think it's Burbank and Cooper who say all empires have this tug between assertion of power by the metropole and tolerance of local difference. And so it's the other thing that's coming in here as I see it, right? I mean, to what degree do we want to bring Muslims in, and to what degree do we want to, again, the Millet system is anachronistic because it's really a 19th century reform, but to what degree is that going on here, the play between those two poles? And then finally, I liked you didn't use the word information technologies, but there's a way in which certain technologies of empire not only have a claim to universality, but become universal. Greenwich Mean Time, the metric system. Yes, exactly. Common Era. It's a rework with Anno-Domini. Who are we kidding, right? So these do take a level of universality. And here, I'm sorry, I'm just going to be the Japan hand. Having worked with Francophile Japanese legal reformers who saw the French legal code as simply the state-of-the-art technology information, and you adopt it not because it's French, because it is the absolute best way to clarify property holding. And here I'm clarifying property holding, and everything is endless litigation. And of course, you want to adopt. I mean, the French were very smart. They took population registers out of the hands of the church. We in Japan want to take them out of the hands of Buddhist clergy. It's not French. It's the universal way of building a powerful state. So it's like the metric system, or the steam engine, or Greenwich Mean Time. It's really not French. So I guess what I'm struck by here is it's very hard to discern the exact intentionality of the agents on the ground, but they're clearly torn between, it worked for the Ottomans, let the Jews be, but then of course we really do have a glorious emancipating universal technology of state power. So let's do that together when we team teach, I think, but does it help your manuscript at all? And again, I'm sorry, that was a comment other than the question, but it's a way of sort of conceptualizing the broader sense, and I hope it's helpful.
Yeah. Well, let me just sort of respond with an example that speaks to this. So the emancipatory model of empire generates itself, expresses itself very clearly in the 1790 Declaration ending wars of conquest. War making is the power of the people, not of monarchs, and people, by their very virtue, will use it as a tool to emancipate themselves and overthrow despots around the world. So that, of course, surprise, surprise, doesn't work out that way on the continent or elsewhere.
I'm sure.
But they sort of, the principle remains there, right? And it's be compromised, it can be parsed, it can be all these sorts of things in practice, but the principles there sort of cat is out of the bag at that particular point. And it also can become a tool. And I think, this is in a sort of naturally cynical way that we can look at these things. This is what Bonaparte does in Egypt. This famous proclamation to Egyptians: I'm coming here and overthrow the despotism of the Mamluk/Ottoman. You're not really clear who's in power there or who his real enemy is. You say the Mamluks, I will restore to you your rights, referring to either a pre-historical moment or some sort of timeless natural rights that have been usurped in this present political configuration, and give all these things back to you, right, which are rightfully yours. Nothing happened to that. In Europe, actually, the story tells itself differently in Egypt than in Europe, because in Europe, a case like Belgium, Colonial worked on Belgium, does a very, very good job with Belgium. They sort of manipulated public opinion, the voice of the people, in a way that's speaking what France wants. In Egypt, they don't even bother, right? There's never a referendum. You want to become part of France, right? Which was offered to these territories in Belgium. None of these sorts of things happen there. Now in Algeria, it's even a later moment in this. In Algeria, there's a proclamation to Algerians, or the people of Algiers and the tribe, is the actual language that he uses. Like Napoleon's proclamation, it is written in Arabic, it's lithographed, and copies are sailed across Tunis and are waiting for distribution across to sort of lead the way before the French soldiers arrive. And as this happens, they're sort of hot off the presses, saying stop the presses, sort of thing. Or some people in Tunis hold on to those things because we're reconceiving what's going to happen here. We are monarchy, the restoration. We are the Bourbons, right? And we're sounding a lot like Napoleon, our arch enemy. What does that mean? Also, we really want to promise these sorts of things, right? We want to commit ourselves, and this is the actual language that's used through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We want to commit ourselves to these. We're making some really substantial promises here. Are we going to follow through on those? And so that just sort of gets shelved, and nothing happens. So the emancipatory model, emancipation over the course of the 19th century reconceived itself into these technical terms, right? We will free you from sickness. We will bring order. We will bring law. These sorts of things, rather than emancipation understood in terms of rights, right? Version of rights.
That's fantastic. That's great. Thank you.
Jacob.
All right, really quick question. Getting close to the time here. So my question is about the first recorded Jewish family that you have, the example you have here. It says, you say that they're most likely Tuscan Jews, but they were reported to Algerian. Is this an example of a European family perhaps being reported as something other than European? And is this something we've seen happen more than once?
Yeah, in some ways, to the actors themselves, they're going to have a different understanding of what we have, I think, with this. Now, and this is, they're becoming European in 1830, right? The empirical backdrop to this is there are families that have branches on both sides of the Mediterranean, right? They'll have cousins and so forth, branches of the family in Livorno, for example, especially in Livorno, Tunis, Algiers, and different places. And so, names are one of the primary sites which identity asserts itself. Okay, and so they have this name that is typical to families that we associate with Italian Jews. But again, what does that mean? They're going back and forth. It becomes something of an identity more hard and fast in the imperial age, because this is more true in Tunis, where the capitulations continue much of the 19th century, because you can have petition as a Tunis, they're called Gurni Jews, We're Italian Jews, we go through the Italian consulate for our legal affairs, right? So there are legal stakes involved in this as well. In any case, the recording agent at the time writes them down in as Algerian Jews. Now, maybe this is a person who is a family who's long, long chain that's been living in Algiers, and this is why the person, the recording agent does this. Maybe there's a different reason, but it's not a hard and fast sort of thing. It becomes more hard and fast as it's written down in paper. And this is sort of suggestion that source.
Well, thank you, everyone. Appreciate the conversation, the answers, Julie's intervention, everyone's intervention, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks.
Thank you.